and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Thank you for having me. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I am speaking from Ottawa, Canada, and I am on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I am an honorary curator of mineralogy and petrology at the Hunterian Museum at the University of Glasgow. And I just wanted to clarify that because I've just moved on from my position as curator, the views are my own because my replacement will be making a lot of these decisions about the collections sort of from their perspective. But today I'll be talking about geological repatriation from museums. And just to start off, museum collections, many of you will know, you will see many objects on exhibit, but of course there's many, many more objects behind the scenes in collections. And a museum like the Hunterian, which I'll use a lot as an example, has many different types of collections that were started from William Hunter, who was an 18th century medical doctor who collected many different things like art, geology, world culture, zoology, and then bequeathed upon his death this collection to the university. So of course, the collection has grown in many ways since then, but many different museums will have so many different types of objects, and it will really depend on the specialty of the museums. To specifically talk about geological collections, so I will be talking specifically about geology collections in terms of rocks and minerals compared to sometimes there will be fossils, but that is not my specialty. But most geological collections will consist of minerals, rocks, gems, and meteorites, and some will specialize in one over the other. Will have higher proportions. Maybe they won't have any gems, maybe they won't have any meteorites, but they will have geological objects. And these objects will be mostly, other than gems, will be kind of culturally unmodified. So they'll be mostly kind of raw, taken from the ground, maybe cleaned up a little bit, but kind of reflect a rock from the ground or a crystal. And people collect rocks and minerals for many reasons. One of them being, especially for museum collections, scientific value. Hunter, when he originally collected minerals, was looking at their medical applications. He didn't really find anything, but currently people use geological collections to look at mineral taxonomy, ore deposits, how the earth formed. They will also deposit minerals and rocks as records of research that has been completed. Also, people collect rocks and minerals for their aesthetic value. Everyone likes something pretty, and especially minerals in their crystal form can be very aesthetically pleasing and great for exhibit. Collections are also historical in value. Someone important might have owned it. There might be value in using it for teaching. It might a rock might show an interesting texture that will be good for students to know. But it's also a record of the natural history of a location that is kept kind of in the public trust for as long as possible. Now, rocks and minerals, minerals are the building blocks of rocks. So kind of how atoms in a molecule, minerals are the atoms, rocks are the molecule. But here we have sort of some nice specimens of calcite on the far left, hematite that's iridescent in the middle is kind of a different form for it. And on the right-hand side is a piece of basalt where you can see the pale kind of greenish tan olivine, which is a mineral kind of forming some parts of that rock. So it's kind of showing you just kind of some of the kind of building blocks. And meteorites, so many countries have laws that pertain to ownership just because it is a very unusual sort of type of rock. They come from space. They have this cultural cachet. People find it very interesting. They're very rare. But they could also be sold on the market, and it's a little bit more unusual to have that. And they're kept in many collections for their scientific value, because it shows a lot about the early solar system or the universe. And usually the biggest pieces of meteorites are kept track of as the main mass of a meteorite, so that we know where to go to when you want to do scientific studies. Now, gems are modified compared to rocks or minerals or meteorites that you'll find in collections. Of course, they're faceted and hold a lot of value in terms of, people know gems in terms of jewelry, but many gems in geological collections actually don't have as much kind of value for jewelry and have more scientific curiosity. It's more of how they're faceted, sort of more the gemological attributes. For example, here I have a photo of a specimen of the mineral cerussite, this beautiful 300 carat gem that sparkles wonderfully, but would be completely inappropriate as jewelry because it is very sensitive to heat and would break very easily. But in a geological collection, it is scientifically, has scientific value. There's also a very small portion of some geological collections that will have carved objects. Usually these are used as examples of how a rock or a mineral might be used in industry, a lot of decorative things. Here's a piece of coal that was carved into a box that looks like a book that was acquired a few decades ago at the museum. So you'll find sometimes pieces of jewelry or curiosities that are these sculptural objects. And sometimes part of the issue of having those in a geological collection is that they might be cataloged under their rock type or their mineral, and not kind of under what their value is as a cultural object. But normally these are pretty small proportions of a collection. And of course, these days, when rocks and minerals end up in a geological collection, there are different ways. Scientific research fieldwork is very common. Researchers will go out, either from staff or professors or people who will then donate, researchers that will donate to the museum. They will go out, do fieldwork, study the rocks, get data, and then deposit the specimens at a museum. One issue of this is something called parachute science, which is something that people are becoming more aware of, which is going to an area, picking up rocks, or even this happens in biology as well, doing field work, but not really involving the local community, and then doing all this work without kind of having that communication there or any collaboration. But what's also interesting about geological collections is that minerals can also be purchased on the mineral market, and it's quite a big thing, and indifferent than other natural history collections in that there's a thriving mineral market. And then of course, sometimes there are donations from professors or from individuals of their kind of privately collected rocks and minerals. And then not as common anymore, but there has been exchanges with individuals or institutions. And there's a lot of sort of history of mining that can be captured in a geological collection. So specimens are sometimes collected as a byproduct of mining and either sort of picked up as a curiosity, or sometimes they're mined on the side in order to have a different revenue stream. There's also mining specifically for specimens. This is smaller in scale, and there are some areas, Brazil, Pakistan. Here's a specimen of a mineral called mesolite, which is from India, where these minerals are specifically mined to be sold on the market. But it's also sometimes a history of, or a record of the mining that occurs. So of course, the Hunterian, being in Scotland, has many coal samples from local coal mines in order to kind of capture that history of the industry in that place. And as a museum, there's sort of this inescapable link to colonization, and that is felt in geological collections. Some samples are taken during exploration, looking for ore deposits for colonizing countries. Samples can be taken from military campaigns. I've not personally seen that in the geological collections I've worked with, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is some out there. Minerals are also named after army leaders who may have had campaigns in indigenous territories. So all these kind of things that have only recently been examined, kind of brought to the forefront in sort of people are looking at their collections in a different way, but that is a more recent advancement, I would say. And for museum collections, especially geology, many of them are worldwide, but will be dominated by sort of their local geology, similar to the Hunterian Museum here, where all those European collections, many of them are Scottish, which is no surprise.
I'm listening to a thing on, do you want to listen to it?
What is it?
It's about mineral collections.
I hope they join in. What is sort of an interesting thing about cataloged specimens is that will give you usually a location or if they're unknown, but with a museum as old as the Hunterian, there is a large backlog, so things are not always cataloged, and that makes it harder to know what you have, and in terms of repatriation efforts, to know for local communities to find what you have as well. So it is sort of a constant sort of effort on museums to try and keep up with cataloging as much as they can. But generally, most institutions have at least a small backlog and sometimes a large backlog. And natural history objects, even biological ones, are not always seen as important or as heritage objects. When someone sees a piece of art, this is a sketch by Whistler, they will immediately know that it can have some cultural value, whereas natural history objects, especially geology, can sometimes just be seen as, oh, that's a lump of rock. So that can sort of get in the way of efforts in terms of decolonization and repatriation, because it is not recognized as easily as such. So repatriation of natural history has been somewhat, I say, it hasn't gone very far compared to other disciplines. And it is exciting that this is happening, but it is something that is going to be gaining momentum in the future. So museums acquire specimens. Nowadays, there's a lot of policies and procedures about having clear legal title, but of course that wasn't always the same in the past. And there's a lot of procedures around how you may get rid of a specimen, whether that is giving it to an institution or something like that. And those procedures can sometimes be seen as roadblocks, and sometimes they are real roadblocks, but it doesn't always have to, it might not remain that way. And there might be some workarounds and some things that can be done to try and change things. An interesting story of repatriation is the story of the Jamaican giant galley wasp. So at the Hunterian Museum, if you've been to the gallery at some point, there is an intervention called Curating Discomfort, which was bringing in community curators who worked with who were mostly from the diaspora community, who were adding either objects to the gallery or different perspectives and sort of interpretations of what was already on display. And the Jamaican giant galley wasp is a lizard from Jamaica, and it was picked as an object on display. And during that time, it was found out that Jamaica itself does not have a specimen of this lizard because it is extinct, and they never had a chance to add it to their collection. So repatriation efforts have started on allowing giving back one of these specimens to one of their institutions. Of course, this does take a lot of time. It's not just kind of putting it in a box, shipping over, and hoping for the best. It is about communicating the way forward and seeing sort of what kind of collaboration and sort of what's best for the institution you're sending it to. There's also been a lot of talk about repatriation of fossils. So there are a lot of laws pertaining to the export of fossils. And especially there's a lot of laws around vertebrate fossils compared to invertebrate fossils. But recently there was someone who discovered a new dinosaur species. They published on it. And it was a Brazilian fossil where it was thought that it had been smuggled out of the country. And so the sort of press around it kind of allowed the Brazilians kind of gain some sort of some sort of attention in bringing back this fossil specimen to Brazil. So they that it's actually set to happen, and just kind of a silver lining to sort of someone published the specimen. I don't know if they knew where sort of the origins of it, but allowing sort of things come into mainstream media and be used as an opportunity to repatriate. And moving on to the repatriation of geological objects in museum institutions, unfortunately, very little has been done on this. And it's a little disappointing in some ways, but not surprising sometimes, because it feels like the history of the field has sometimes focused solely on the scientific value of the specimens and not sort of their wider cultural context. So for looking at repatriation, I reached out to colleagues, and there was sort of very little experience in repatriation and very little examples. So I'll go through an example, but really one of the questions is where do you start? A museum like the Hunterian has 120,000 rocks and minerals. Where do you start when it comes to sort of seeing if anything should be repatriated, and how do you start those conversations? So one of the one example that I've found of repatriation of a geological object from a museum is the Manitou-Assini meteorite. So this was a meteorite that is sacred to Albertan and Saskatchewan First Nations. And in 1866, a missionary took it from the land to his church in an attempt to have more people convert to Christianity. Over time, it ended up at the University of Toronto, and then at the Royal Ontario Museum. After there were calls to repatriate it, the Royal Ontario Museum transferred it to the Royal Alberta Museum in 2001 on sort of a long-term loan on behalf of the First Nations, so that it was under the care of the Royal Alberta Museum until a local museum could be built for it. And they did a lot of consultation with the First Nations so that they could care for it properly. So staff smudge the meteorite. There's also no photos or videos allowed of this meteorite. So sort of they've worked a lot with the community to understand what their needs are, and sort of the way forward is currently still at the Royal Alberta Museum. And sort of some discussions around repatriation of geological objects. So for example, gems and minerals can sometimes be commodities. So they're sold on the market, and many geological collections have purchased these over time. And how does that fit into repatriation? It has a clear provenance, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't power imbalances that have occurred and that there might be some problematic past to some of these specimens that would need to be rectified. And this is where some of the conversations to start just around different types of objects and what the possibilities might be. And there's also something called type specimens. These are really interesting because they're the specimens that were used to describe a new mineral species. So they're very, very valuable to science in terms that you need to keep them in a public institution to be accessible to other scientists, because as technology changes, you're going to go back to the original specimen to update the analyses. For example, this is data on new mineral species from 1974, which with current technology, those measurements would be more accurate and maybe a little bit different. So it's really important to preserve for science, and sometimes different pieces are at different institutions, which can be seen as a good thing, because if something happens to one museum, there is still some specimen in other institutions. But it kind of does sometimes show a parachute science, because not all of the type specimens end up in institutions that are near where that specimen came from. And moving forward, it's about kind of figuring out how type specimens fit into that, and communicating and working with local communities towards their importance. So the question becomes, how can we sort of push the field a little further in museums? Geology is behind other sectors in terms of like cultural objects or art in terms of discussions around repatriation. It's something that can be seen sort of as not as important as other disciplines, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be discussed or sort of explored. And there can be an ignorance on the part of collections and just kind of focusing on some aspects of the collections and ignoring the wider cultural context. But that doesn't mean repatriation is what's going to happen to every object, because there's a lot of different options and a lot of work to be done. Repatriation of data is one of the options. I've seen 3D scans of objects being an option when laws might get in the way of repatriating objects, sort of a stopgap measure. Some communities may not want specimens back. And part of that is, I clearly like rocks and minerals a lot. I've made them my career, but not everyone cares about rocks and minerals, and they might not be also prioritized compared to other specimens and other objects that might be repatriated. Communities only have so much time and so much energy in putting towards these kind of efforts. And for example, the Hunterian is working on repatriating human remains. That is something that's clearly going to take priority over geological objects. Now, when it comes to geological objects with so many, how do you prioritize? Of course, objects from sacred locations should be a priority. Speaking to a colleague who's an archaeologist, and this is why it's important to kind of speak outside your discipline, pointed out that the Maori find some locations of quarries of jadeite and nephrite to be very important to them. So something like that might be a place to start. And of course, any rocks and minerals of cultural significance would be a priority over a tray of rocks that might not be. And many local communities might already have samples from these locations and may not want them back. They might want to do some sort of ceremony. They might want to repatriate data. So there's a lot of different options. And there's sort of asking what the way forward, and sort of the first step for, I think, discussions around repatriating geological objects is, what do the communities want? It's going to be sort of not one size fits all. It's going to be a case by case basis. And it's just about starting those discussions and having a dialogue that's respectful, and it's all about communication. So that would be, I think, where the geological community in museums need to go forward in order to start these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika. We have a couple of minutes left. If there are any questions, we can take questions in the room, and we can also take questions online. Well, then maybe I will start with a question. Erika, what do you think about, so the inscriptions, the Sangguran and the Pujangan, the Minto stone and the Kolkata stone, would you consider them to be geological artifacts, or would they be considered as archaeological artifacts because they're inscriptions, though they are also stones? What do you think about that?
I would consider them cultural objects of geological origin, I guess. Many kind of we use a lot of geological substances for other things. You know, it's why we mine. But I think that cultural modification of the inscription changes it into a quite distinctive cultural object. And so if someone were to acquire that into a museum, I would not see that in geology collection. I would see that in an world cultures or archaeology collection. And in the past, sometimes, 200 years ago, people would just go out and collect everything, and anything that was rock would end up in a geology collection. So sometimes you'd get a sculpture that would be cataloged under serpentine. And so if you were looking at the catalog, you would think it's a rock, and then you would go and see, oh no, this is a sculpture. And I've seen that at the Hunterian, but they've tried and transfer all of those into the archaeology or the world cultures collections.
Dimas, do we have any questions online? Maybe take one. No, there's no question. Okay, great. Then we will move on. Thank you very much, Erika.